In 1945, Eric Arthur Blair, or better known by his pen name George Orwell, published a small novella called Animal Farm. While it was a story about animals, it also served as a harsh criticism of totalitarianism. It shows in vivid detail how the temptation of power perverts justice, even in a fair system. Now, even though this book was published in 1945, it was actually written between 1943 and 1944. If you pay attention to these dates, you can tell why these were inconvenient times to say the least. Let's just say the most famous art school reject was still in full force. Now, because of this, you might think that Animal Farm is a critique of Funny Mustache Man, but you would be wrong, it's not. It's a critique of Funny Mustache Man number 2. Because Joseph Stalin was a communist, many people consider Animal Farm to be a critique of communism. I mean, even now, if you look at the covers of Animal Farm, you will see a sickle here and there, and those are the subtle ones. Sometimes it's literally just a pig in Stalin's uniform. But George Orwell was a committed democratic socialist. He believed in most of the ideals of communism. He was specifically critiquing Stalinism, not communism. In fact, throughout the book, he kind of portrayed communism as something noble. So why does everyone think it's a critique of communism? Surely it's not because the government had an incentive to push a short, easy-to-read book that critiques their greatest enemy's perceived ideology. Foreshadowing is a literary device. George Orwell might be one of the goats of literature, but you cannot tell me that this man was subtle. This book is just a retelling of the Russian Revolution, word for word, bar for bar. I was going to say that if you read the book closely, you can see parallels between characters in this book and real-life figures during the revolution. But you don't even have to do all that. Just a casual reading and you can immediately tell who each animal is supposed to represent, with only a few notable exceptions. I could sit here and name all of them right now, but I think it'll be better to mention who each animal is supposed to represent as we go on throughout the story. This book is a classic now, but it was heavily suppressed during its early years. In fact, it was basically considered treason. Before World War II officially broke out, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression treaty called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were allies. Or should I say they were axes? Please don't click off. However, everything changed in June of 1941. Germany betrayed Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, betraying the non-aggression treaty. Over 3.8 million troops invaded the Soviet Union and got pretty far into their land. By the end of the operation, 8 million lives were lost. The Soviet Union, a country that seemed almost untouchable, were now on its last legs. Right when all seemed lost, an unlikely ally stepped in to help. And that man was Winston Churchill. This was a surprise because Churchill, being the Prime Minister of the UK, was the single biggest op of the Soviet Union. Not only were the Soviet Union allies with the Funny Mustache Man, who was actively bombing the United Kingdom, they were also communists. Winston Churchill felt about communists the same way you feel about people who pour milk before cereal. He wanted to commit war crimes on them. But Churchill was practical. He knew that having the Soviet Union on their side would be a great asset. So he made an alliance between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union to fight against Germany. This meant that the British and American governments were suddenly faced with a new challenge. They needed to convince people that Stalin was an all-American freedom-loving ally. This was not exactly easy to do because they had spent the last few years spinning the propaganda machine against Stalin. Now they needed to undo all that. But somehow they kind of succeeded. In just a few years, Britain started calling Stalin, top 5 dictators of all time, Uncle Joe. Not only did they push propaganda for him, but they also actively censored information about Stalin that didn't fit the narratives. The Great Purges,
pure fiction.
The famines in Ukraine,
is totally made up.
The assassinations of his political rivals,
It's a made-up tale.
This is where George Orwell comes in. See, Orwell wasn't just an ordinary writer, he was also a war veteran. In 1937, he fought in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists. Since Orwell was a British socialist, he was assigned to the POUM, a revolutionary Marxist militia who were anti-Stalinists, which meant that the Soviet Union, who was supplying the Spanish Republic with the weapons they used against the fascists, absolutely hated them. Keep this in mind, it'll be important in a minute. Orwell also made a joke around this time saying that he was an easy target for the snipers because he was 6'2". But this humble bragging quickly turned into a reality because he was actually shot in the neck. The bullet barely missed his arteries, a few centimeters to the side, and Orwell would have died right then and there. He was taken to Barcelona to recover from his injury, but this is when a civil war broke out within a civil war. So you remember when I told you that the Soviet Union did not like the fact that they were supplying rifles to anti-Stalinists? Well, They said that they would only give the Spanish Republic weapons if they eliminated the POUM. The Spanish Republic buckled under the pressure, and by June of 1937, the POUM were outlawed. The men that Orwell fought alongside were being hunted down and executed without trial. Not by fascists, but by Soviet-backed communists. Orwell realized he was going to be next, and posing as wealthy tourists, he and his wife escaped, only to return home to see the man that killed his friends being praised as a hero. Who could blame him for being angry? This was when he sat down and wrote Animal Farm to show the British public who exactly they were supporting. It being marketed as a fairy story for children was just to get him published. If you read the book for 5 minutes, you'll realize it's not about animals. Even after it was written, it was treated like a nuclear wasteland by publishers. None of them would touch it with a 10-foot pole, because whether they liked it or not, it was undeniable that the USSR was one of Britain's most vital allies against Germany. They couldn't risk offending them, even with a novella about a suspiciously Stalin-shaped pig. Like, there were multiple instances of publishers liking the writing of Animal Farm, but still refusing to publish it for political reasons. To add insult to injury, in June of 1944, a few months after completing the manuscript of Animal Farm, Orwell's apartment was bombed by the Nazis. He had to go through the rubble of his home and literally dig up the only manuscript of Animal Farm. To complete the triple special, George Orwell at the time was suffering from chronic lung issues, which later turned out to be undiagnosed tuberculosis, which meant that he was also literally dying during all of this. The government didn't want this published, apparently neither did God. Knowing the history behind this thing changes how you read it entirely. Though it's a very short book, my copy here is only 143 pages. I'm splitting this analysis into 2 parts. You'll see why when we get there. So, without further ado, let's get into the story of the real Animal Farm. The story opens in the dead of night at Manor Farm. We're introduced to Mr. Jones, the owner, as he hits the bed after a night of drinking. In this quiet, all the animals on the farm gather. A beau called Old Major had called a meeting. He apparently had a strange dream yesterday that he wanted to tell the animals about. Old Major was 12 years old, making him one of the oldest animals on the farm, and also the most respected. Whenever he was speaking, the animals were ready to listen. We're introduced to the rest of the cast as they come in one by one. First came the dogs and the pigs, then the hens, then the sheep and cows, then 2 horses, 1 mare called Clover, and 1 stallion called Boxer. Now, Boxer may be a horse, but he's actually the goat. He's the closest thing Animal Farm has to a hero. Boxer is strong, hardworking, well-respected, and most importantly, loyal. He's by far one of the most likable characters in this book. Every time he's on screen, you want the best for him. He's literally a gentle giant. Like, John Coffey from the Green Mile. Nothing bad will ever happen to these characters, am I right?
Wrong.
After the goat came in an actual goat called Muriel, and behind her came Benjamin the donkey. He's the oldest and smartest animal on the farm, and in my opinion, he's the most mysterious character in the book. He does not have any direct parallel to a real life figure, yet has the most page time out of all side characters. I mean, just look at the way the book describes him. He seldom talked, and when he did, it was usually to make some cynical remark. For instance, he would say that God had given him a tail to keep the flies off, but that he would sooner have no tail and no flies. Alone among the animals on the farm, he never laughed. If asked why, he would say that he saw nothing to laugh at. The only thing humanizing him, or should I say, animalizing him, is the fact that Benjamin's only friend is Boxer, who he seems to deeply care for. Next came in Molly, a pretty white mare chewing a lump of sugar, and a black cat that is not given a name. I want you to take note of these characters and where they sit to hear Old Major's speech. Even though Molly came in last, she took a place in the front, and the unnamed black cat squeezed herself between the 2 horses, getting the most comfortable seat. When I read this scene a second time for this video, I noticed how eerily the placement of animals at this speech foreshadows their place in the hierarchy later down in the story. Like, the fact that some animals, despite coming in late like Molly or the cat, are given better seats than animals like the hens. The only animal on the farm that didn't show up to Old Major's speech is Moses the raven, who is still sleeping. After Old Major realized that everyone is here, he begins to speak. He says that during his long life, he had time to think about a lot of things. He talks about the state of animals on the farm, how they are only given enough food and water to survive, and they work till their bodies fail. The life of an animal is misery. But Manor Farm has enough natural resources for the animals to live comfortably. So why don't they? Old Major's answer was simple. because nearly the whole of the produce of our labor is stolen from us by human beings. There, comrades, is the answer to all our problems. It is summed up in a single word: man. He turns to each animal one by one and starts telling them what humans have taken away from them. He talks to the cows about milk, the chickens about eggs, and the horses about their falls. He explains that even after humans strip them of everything, once their bodies eventually fail, they are simply harvested for meat and bone. Old Major admits that he's one of the few lucky ones who didn't meet this fate. His message was crystal clear: rebellion against the humans, and they all need to start preparing for it now. He also drops one line that you will find painfully ironic as we go through the rest of the book. And remember, comrades, your resolution must never falter. No argument must lead you astray. Never listen when they tell you that man and the animals have a common interest, that the prosperity of the one is the prosperity of the others. It is all lies. Man serves the interest of no creature except himself. And among us animals, let there be perfect unity, perfect comradeship in the struggle. All men are enemies. All animals are comrades. Finally, Old Major gets to the dream. He couldn't put the whole thing into words, but it showed him a vision of a world without humans, a world where animals were actually free. But the dream did bring back one clear memory: an old song his mother used to sing to him when he was still a piglet. It's called Beasts of England. It's a song about the day where all animals are finally free from their human overlords. Even though Old Major isn't much of a vocalist, he starts singing. And soon enough, every animal on the farm is picking up the words and joining in. They sang it again and again, 5 times in a row. But the noise wakes up Jones, and like any rational farmer, he whips out a shotgun and starts blasting. The animals barely dodge the spray of bullets before scattering back to their beds for the night. 3 nights later, Old Major passes away peacefully in his sleep. But even though he's gone, his speech lit a fire under the rest of the animals. The pigs, being the smartest animals on the farm, took on the job of teaching everyone else. And while there are dozens of pigs in the story, there are only 3 you need to actually remember: Napoleon, Snowball, and Squealer. Napoleon was a massive, imposing boar. He was the silent type, never really one for big speeches or ideas. Snowball, however, was much more inventive and proactive. Then there's Squealer, who was so incredibly persuasive that the animals said he could turn black into white. Now, Squealer is my least favorite character in this entire book. He's basically this meme but with his speech stat maxed out. So he gets away with absolutely everything. You'll see why he's my number 1 op as we go through the text, but for now, you're supposed to like him. Together, these 3 turned Old Major's teachings into a complete system of thought called animalism. Animalism? That sounds exactly like communism. Yeah, animalism is communism. Like I said, the man was not subtle. And since Old Major literally invented the ideas of animalism, he represents Karl Marx, or possibly Vladimir Lenin. Now, if you still don't believe me when I say that this book isn't anti-communist, just look at how animalism is being described here. It's framed as this noble ideology that wants all animals to be free and equal. The only real criticism you'll find here is that it might be a little too naive. It hinges on the idea that no animal would ever turn on their own or fall for the temptation of power and greed. According to Orwell, animalism fails not because it's inherently bad, but because of human or pig nature. It should also be clear that Manor Farm is Russia. I think you already got that by the fact that I said the words Russian Revolution at least 3 times by now. Since Jones owned Manor Farm, he's obviously Tsar Nicholas II. He ruled Russia with an iron fist and genuinely believed his power came straight from God. Under his rule, the peasant majority was buried in crushing debt. Their crops failed and they were quite literally starving to death. On top of that, they were grinding out 12 to 15-hour workdays for a wage they could barely live on. So yeah, safe to say he wasn't exactly a freedom-loving American. Every night after Jones passed out, the trio, Napoleon, Snowball, and Squealer, would hold secret meetings to teach the others about animalism. They were trying to prep them for the revolution, but they kept running into walls of doubt. Some animals were worried they'd starve without Jones, others didn't see a point in preparing for something that might not happen in their lifetime, and then there was Molly, who consistently asked the absolute dumbest questions like, will there still be sugar after the rebellion? And shall I still be allowed to wear ribbons in my mane? Snowball shut her down immediately. He told her sugar was off the menu and that ribbons were basically just badges of slavery. According to the rules of animalism, if a human made it, an animal shouldn't be wearing it. As annoying as Molly was, the real headache for the pigs was Moses the Raven. Moses would tell the others about Sugar Candy Mountain, a magical place where cakes grow on bushes and it's always Sunday. The pigs hated this because if you think you're going to animal heaven when you die, you're way less likely to risk your life in a revolution today. Plus, Moses was kind of a bum and had no reason to join the cause. Jones kept him happy with beer-soaked bread, so as far as he was concerned, the status quo was great. Now I told you that Orwell was not subtle, right? Who do you think Moses the Raven represents? He represents the Russian Orthodox Church, always talking about heaven while doing absolutely nothing to stop people from dying in the here and now. The church was a massive supporter of the Tsar, especially since they were the ones pushing that divine right to rule narrative. But the pigs didn't have to worry about Moses' propaganda for long, because the rebellion kicked off way sooner than anyone expected. Lately, Jones had fallen on hard times. After losing a lawsuit, he spiraled into alcoholism, which meant that the animals' already scarce rations were cut even further. At this point, they were barely being fed at all. One day, a cow reached her limit and burst through the shed door with her horns. The other animals followed suit, desperate to get to the food bins. Jones arrived with his whip and started lashing out, but for the first time, the animals fought back. Jones quickly realized that he couldn't handle their combined might and fled. The only animal to follow him was Moses the Raven. The animals were stunned. This wasn't part of the plan, and they were honestly waiting for Jones to reappear at any moment. But once the shock wore off, the purge began. Anything that even smelled like humans, whips, reins, and even ribbons, was thrown straight into the fire. It wasn't until the next morning when they looked out over the fields that the truth finally hit them. They were free. Manor Farm, which had looked like a prison just 24 hours ago, suddenly looked beautiful because for the first time, the land actually belonged to them. After the dust settled, the animals approached the farmhouse, a place that, until now, had been strictly forbidden. Snowball and Napoleon forced the door open, and the rest of the animals followed them in. To their eyes, Jones's house was a palace. It was massive, filled with luxuries and multiple bedrooms. The animals decided that the farmhouse should be preserved as a museum and that no one should ever live there. After this, Snowball crossed out the name Manor Farm and renamed it Animal Farm. To keep everyone on the same page, the pigs boiled down their entire ideology of animalism into 7 simple commandments. They painted them in big, bold letters on the side of the barn, and they went like this. 1. Whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy. 2. Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend. 3. No animal shall wear clothes. 4. No animal shall sleep in a bed. 5. No animal shall drink alcohol. 6. No animal shall kill any other animal. 7. All animals are equal. Now you'd think that this is where the story ends. Jones is gone, the animals are happy, it's a perfect finale. But this is just the beginning. The real story of Animal Farm is about the slow, painful corruption of these 7 commandments. It's a study on how power-hungry leaders rewrite history to suit their needs, a concept Orwell would go on to explore further in his final novel, 1984. After Snowball read the list, the animals began attempting to memorize the new laws. However, with the exception of the pigs and Benjamin, most of them struggled to remember even one commandment. This might just seem like a small detail now, but trust me, it becomes incredibly important as the story goes on. The cows, used to being milked early every morning, were in actual pain and needed to be milked immediately. The pigs stepped up and filled some buckets with milk. The animals began wondering how they would share the prize. Maybe a little bit of milk in everyone's mash. That's what Jones used to do, and that was good. That's when we hear Napoleon speak for the first time, and his response is interesting. "Never mind the milk, comrades," cried Napoleon, placing himself in front of the buckets. "That will be attended to. The harvest is more important. Comrade Snowball will lead the way. I shall follow in a few minutes. Forward, comrades, the hay is waiting." The animals finish their work and head back, only to find that the milk has vanished. Orwell doesn't technically state who the thief was, but it's painfully obvious it was Napoleon. It's a small moment, sure, but it's the first real crack in the whole all animals are equal ideology. It's our first look at how greed corrupts the farm. But it didn't matter right now because the harvest was the best they had ever seen. And the best part is they didn't have to hand the majority of it to Jones. Every animal worked their heart out except for pigs who, of course, supervised everyone with their superior intellect. But the real MVP was Boxer. Boxer worked harder than any animal on the farm. He worked from dawn until dusk and never seemed to tire, even waking up 30 minutes before everyone just to get a head start. He adopted a simple motto for every challenge: I will work harder. More than anything, what was truly miraculous was the fact that no animal stole even a single grain. They all ate their share happily. The only ones who didn't do their duty were Molly, who would arrive late and leave early, and the cat, who did nothing, but her excuses were so smooth that everyone just let it slide. Every animal seemed happier except for Benjamin. He didn't overwork himself like Boxer, nor did he loaf like Molly. He just did his job with zero enthusiasm. Whenever the others asked him why he wasn't celebrating, he'd just give them the same cryptic answer: donkeys live a long time. None of you has ever seen a dead donkey. Sundays were the only holidays. Every week after breakfast, the animals would gather for a flag raising ceremony. Snowball had actually made the flag himself out of a green tablecloth, painting a white hoof and horn right in the center. Snowball explained the design like this. Flag was green, Snowball explained, to represent the green fields of England, while the hoof and horn signified the future republic of the animals which would arise when the human race had been finally overthrown. After the ceremony, they'd head to the barn for the meeting, a place where any animal could voice their opinion, but in reality, only Snowball and Napoleon would speak. These two were constantly at each other's throats. If one made a suggestion, you could bet your life the other would oppose it. It was a heated rivalry, yet no matter how bitter the debate got, the sessions always ended the same way, with every animal singing Beasts of England. The animals think that this is equality, but look at the power dynamic. The all animals are equal rule is already being tested because only the pigs are actually participating in the debates. Since they're the most educated, the rest of the animals just pick a side between Napoleon and Snowball. They aren't thinking for themselves. They're just choosing a leader. The pigs are essentially speedrunning a creation of a new upper class, something they fought to destroy. But this time the class system is not based on wealth. It's about who is clever enough to run things, and the pigs are making sure they are the only ones in that category. Like in the very next scene, the pigs move their headquarters into the harness room, the same room humans previously used to castrate them. There, they started teaching themselves the necessary arts of running a farm: blacksmithing, carpentry, you name it. Now you might be thinking, isn't this getting a little too close to being human, using human tools in a human house? But it'll probably be fine, am I right?
It's false.
Snowball even started forming committees for every different type of animal, the most famous one being the re-education committee. Now, don't worry, this isn't the kind of re-education the famous Austrian painter was doing. It was basically just a way to keep everyone in line. Snowball tried to reach out to wild animals like rats and pigeons who weren't officially part of the farm. The unnamed cat, who, let's remember, hasn't done a single lick of work up until this point, was suddenly a super active member of the committee. Like, really proactive. Dang, I guess she deeply cares about the social progress of the minority. Oh wait, no, she just wanted to get close to the birds to eat them. So the committees were a bust, but the pigs did launch a reading and writing program. Now this started with good intentions, but it quickly exposed a massive discrepancy in the intelligence across the farm. The pigs and the dogs mastered reading and writing almost immediately. Muriel could get through a newspaper if she logged in, but the rest of the animals could barely grasp the alphabet. Take Boxer for example. He could only ever learn the first 4 letters. Every time he tried to memorize E, F, G, and H, he'd completely forget A, B, C, and D. Eventually, he just gave up and settled for knowing the first 4. Molly was in a similar boat, but for much more narcissistic reasons. She only bothered to learn the 6 letters needed to spell her name. She'd write Molly in the dirt, decorate it with flowers, and call it a day. Truly a pillar of the community. But by far the dumbest animals on the farm were the hens, ducks, and sheep. These guys couldn't even grasp the letter A, which meant that they had zero hope of memorizing the 7 commandments. To solve this, the pigs decided to boil down the 7 commandments even further into one simple maxim: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. If you're familiar with Animal Farm at all, you probably already know this quote. I mean, it's literally on the cover of my copy. But this moment is also important because now the pigs and the dogs are the only ones who understand the true essence of animalism, while the majority are left down with a watered down version. These animals are now incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. The only reason they're safe for the moment is because Snowball is a noble leader. And as we know, nobility rarely lasts in power. The new maxim was an instant hit with the sheep. They immediately started chanting the phrase over and over, despite having zero clue what it actually meant. But hey, can you blame them? They're literally sheep. As an aside, you know that thing people do on the internet where they call each other sheep for parroting the popular opinion? I'm fairly certain that this book is where it originated from. So yeah, fun Animal Farm fact. Right after the harvest, the dogs gave birth to 9 little puppies, but they didn't get to stay with their family for long. Napoleon immediately whisked them away, telling the parents that he would take full responsibility for their education. Now, reading this in 2026, I immediately thought that Napoleon went to that island, but no, thankfully Napoleon isn't that kind of monster, he's just a political monster. Wait, under the same thing, Napoleon kept the puppies in total seclusion. He was the only one with access to them, and after a while, the rest of the farm simply forgot they existed. But here's the thing. By doing this, Napoleon has officially broken the golden rule of animalism. All animals are equal. By handpicking these puppies for special treatment, Napoleon is playing God with the new class system. He's deciding who ascends and who stays at the bottom. Compare that to Snowball, who tries to teach everyone equally despite how dumb they are. Like, look at how much power education has on the farm. When the animals discover that the missing milk and apples are going directly into the pigs' bellies, Squealer is sent out to do damage control. Watch how he dismantles their argument. "Comrades," he cried, "you do not imagine, I hope, that we pigs are doing this in spirit of selfishness and privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples. I dislike them myself. Our sole object in taking these things is to preserve our health. Milk and apples, this has been proved by science, comrades, contain substances absolutely necessary to the well-being of a pig. We pigs are brain workers. The whole management and organization of this farm depend on us. Day and night, we are watching over your welfare. It is for your sake that we drink that milk and eat those apples. Do you know what would happen if we pigs failed in our duty? Jones would come back. Yes, Jones would come back. Surely, comrades," cried Squealer almost pleadingly, skipping from side to side and whisking his tail. "Surely there's no one among you who wants to see Jones come back." Squealer doesn't even bother with a rational explanation. Instead, he just blinds them with science. Like, do you really think sheep that can't get past the letter A is going to understand the nutritional complexities of brain food? Bro, even I don't understand what that is. But it's the second half of Squealer's argument that I want you to focus on. He brings up the one thing that terrifies them, the threat of Jones coming back. Since no animal wants Jones to return, they just accept it. It didn't even matter if the threat was real. This sets a dangerous precedent. If your leaders can convince you that an alternative is a nightmare, they can get away with anything. If there's anyone who could call out the pigs on this, it's Benjamin. He isn't fooled for a second. He was literate before the pigs were even born, maybe even earlier than Old Major. But when he sees this obvious abuse of power, he remains silent. He's convinced that life is inherently miserable with or without humans. This apathy is going to come back to bite him in the butt later on. Get it? Because he's a donkey? I spent time on that joke, by the way. The pigs started playing the long game. They sent out waves of birds to neighboring farms with one mission: spread the news of the rebellion and, most importantly, teach every animal they met how to sing Beasts of England. By the end of the summer, the name Animal Farm had spread across the country. Naturally, even human farmers heard about this directly from Jones. But while they acted sympathetic to his face, they were secretly plotting on how to turn his misfortune to their own advantage. The neighboring farm owners here are a direct parallel to leaders of nations who are just waiting for a country like Russia to fall. Now let's look at the two closest neighbors of Animal Farm. First, there's Foxwood, an old-fashioned farm owned by Mr. Pilkington. He's described as an easygoing guy, the type of guy who spends most of his time fishing and hunting instead of actually running his business. Then you have Pinchfield. It's smaller, but it's tight and well-kept. It's owned by Mr. Frederick, a man described as tough, shrewd, and consistently embroiled in lawsuits. So you know how Animal Farm is Russia, right? Looking at the description, who do you think Frederick is? Go on. I'm waiting. You know what? Let me make it easy for you. Ah, perfect. So Frederick and his farm Pinchfield represent the most famous art school reject and Germany respectively, and Pilkington and Foxwood represent the Allies, or more specifically, Winston Churchill and Britain. These two men absolutely despise each other. They can't agree on anything except for one thing: the revolution and Animal Farm is a threat. It's no coincidence that the only thing Pilkington and Frederick can agree upon is that Animal Farm is a problem. It proves that their authority isn't permanent. If their animals see that a rebellion can actually work, they might wonder why they're still taking orders. You can actually see these farmers go through denial in real time. They flat out refuse to call it Animal Farm, stubbornly sticking to Manor Farm. They convince themselves that the revolution wouldn't last, that the animals would starve to death within a month. But as time passed and the farm kept on running, they couldn't huff copium anymore. They had to face the facts. Animal Farm was thriving. So Frederick and Pilkington started a full-blown smear campaign against Animal Farm. They started spreading wild rumors like animals at Animal Farm were secretly torturing each other and stuff, but the other animals didn't buy it. Instead, a counter-narrative spread that Animal Farm was a literal paradise. This sparked a wave of mini rebellions across England. Animals everywhere were acting out and, most importantly, singing Beasts of England. The humans absolutely hated this song. They'd beat any animal even caught humming it. But the tune spread like wildfire. And even though they wouldn't admit it, they were secretly terrified. One day, Jones returned to the farm with a small army of men from Foxford and Pinchfield. While the men carried sticks, Jones was armed with a gun. He was here to take back his farm. However, Snowball had prepared for this by studying military history. He strategically placed the animals, first sending the birds to distract the invaders. Then, Snowball, Muriel, Benjamin, and the sheep launched a direct assault. After a brief skirmish, Snowball signaled a retreat, leading the humans to believe that they had won. Just as they were beginning to celebrate, the cows, pigs, and horses rushed back out, having waited for Snowball's perfect moment to strike. Jones raised his gun and fired. The bullet grazed Snowball's back, leaving a bloody streak, but the sheep standing right behind him wasn't so lucky. She dropped dead instantly. Without missing a beat, Snowball launched his entire weight at Jones, sending the man flying and his gun skittering across the dirt. But the most terrifying animal on the battlefield was Boxer. He was like a force of nature. One of the stable lads tried to take him on, but Boxer delivered a kick so powerful it sent the man straight to the ground, lifeless. When the other men saw this, they fled. Every animal on the farm, even the cat, pulled up to chase them. Within 5 minutes, Jones and his militia were gone. It was over, but amidst the cheering, Boxer remained in the yard. He stood over the man he'd knocked down, trying to turn him over with his hoof. The man didn't move. Thinking he'd committed murder, Boxer whispered, "I had no intention of doing that. I forgot that I was wearing iron shoes. Who will believe that I did not do this on purpose?" I love Boxer so much. He's such a sweetheart, man. But not everyone was a war hero. Molly, true to her character, vanished the second things got real. But while the search party was looking for her, the dead man in the yard woke up, realized he was surrounded by very angry animals, and Usain bolted his way out of there. Which means thankfully Boxer had just given him the world's most aggressive nap, instead of taking him straight to Sugar Candy Mountain. After they confirmed that all the humans had gone, the animals burst into celebration. The flag was hoisted and Beasts of England was sung multiple times. Snowball dropped a speech about the glory of sacrifice and then officially honored the sheep who was caught in the crossfire. They gave her the title Animal Hero Second Class, while Snowball and Boxer took First Class. The animals found Jones's gun on the yard and rather than getting rid of the thing, they decided to use it as glorified fireworks. They agreed to fire it twice a year, once on the anniversary of the original rebellion and once on the anniversary of this battle, which they had named the Battle of the Cowshed. Now is the perfect time to tell you that Snowball is a direct stand-in for Leon Trotsky. Much like Snowball, Trotsky was extremely intelligent, a brilliant speaker, a prolific writer, and a true believer in Marxist ideology. In fact, he was the strategic mastermind behind the 1917 revolution. When the Soviet state was threatened by civil war, Trotsky built the Red Army out of scratch and crushed the anti-communist forces. It's a beat-for-beat mirror of Snowball leading the animals against the farmers. At this moment in the story, Snowball is the de facto leader. He's arguably the most powerful and respected animal on the farm. But as you know, being the most powerful often puts a target on your back. As time passed, everyone noticed there was something off with Molly. She'd always been a bum, but now she just stopped trying. She was late every morning, dipped out early every afternoon, and spent her working hours staring at her own reflection in the drinking pool. But the real scandal was happening in the border. Molly had been hanging around the hedge that divided Animal Farm from Foxford, talking to a human and even letting him pet her. When Clover called her out, Molly denied everything and ran away. But when Clover went to her stall, she found the evidence: a stash of multicolored ribbons and lumps of sugar. 3 days later, Molly was gone. The birds eventually tracked her down on another farm. She was being pampered by a new human, fresh ribbons on her forelock and happily munching on sugar. Molly had officially traded her comrade status for the life of pet. No animal ever mentioned her name again. Molly might be a minor character in the grand scheme of things, but she's an example of a character choosing comfort over freedom. She and the cat were the privileged of the old society that had the luxury of leaving when the system no longer suited them. And that's exactly what Molly did. The worst part is she probably has the happiest ending in this entire book. It wasn't because she was smart or strong or even hardworking, it was simply because she was lucky enough to leave at the right time, before Animal Farm descended into the nightmare it's famous for. January arrived, the winter hit, and the crops began to die. This is when the meetings started. Curiously, meetings held only by the pigs. The other animals just accepted this because the pigs have big brains, right? They should be the ones drafting policy. But by doing this, the animals effectively signed away their right to voice an opinion, pushing the pigs even further up the social hierarchy. Napoleon and Snowball again couldn't agree on a single thing. Snowball would dominate during the meetings. His speeches were brilliant, but Napoleon was playing a quieter, dirtier game. He was building a huge following of sheep. They were the most common animals in the farm and also the easiest to manipulate. And this was about to become a major problem. See, Napoleon had a new tactic where whenever Snowball was making a speech, he would instruct the sheep to bleat out 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, breaking his flow. But this didn't seem to affect Snowball's reputation much. Being the innovator he is, he had been studying about technology that could improve the farm. He talked about drains and fertilizing the plants with manure. Napoleon just sat there quietly, muttering disagreements, but not actually producing any schemes of his own. However, he seemed to be waiting for something, biding his time. The biggest argument between Snowball and Napoleon was about the windmill. See, there was a long pasture of free land on the farm that was basically doing nothing. Snowball said that it should be used for a windmill. He had learned that a windmill produces electricity which could give them lights during the nights and warm them during the winter. Maybe, if utilized properly, they could even automate the work of the farm. The animals listened to Snowball in total fascination. To them, electricity was practically magic. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were already taking shape. He'd lock himself in his shed for hours, surrounded by books, meticulously working on it. Little by little, a diagram emerged on the floor. The animals would shuffle in to admire it, awestruck, all except for Napoleon. He walked in, looked at the diagram, and without saying a single word, literally pissed on the plans before walking away. Now, because Napoleon and Snowball practically had all the votes on the farm, the animals were deeply divided on this topic. The only animal that did not side with either of them was Benjamin, who frankly didn't care. I mean, just look at how he saw it.
Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it had always gone on. That is, badly.
The thing that really sticks out to me here is Napoleon and Snowball's debate on how they should deal with human invaders if they were to return. Napoleon said that they should get more firearms, while Snowball said that they should send out even more birds to rile up the animals on other farms, so they rebel against their human owners. It's interesting that Snowball is a modernist who tells the animals that if they put in the work right now, they can spend the rest of their lives literally enjoying the fruits of their labor. But Napoleon caters to the animals with the lowest intelligence, like the sheep, who can't see past their immediate future. At the meeting on Sunday, even though he was interrupted by the sheep, Snowball put forth a plan on how to build the windmill. Snowball was cooking with the speech, telling the animals how the windmill would allow them to be free and have a better future. Up until this point, the animals were divided on who to vote for, but now it was clear. Snowball was superior. But what about Napoleon? Usually Napoleon would mutter an objection, but today he seemed deathly calm. He didn't even offer a defense. He didn't seem to care. I have a confession to make. While I was laying out the parallels between Snowball and Trotsky, I omitted one detail: how it actually ended. Trotsky was a visionary. He was intelligent, charismatic, but he made one fatal mistake. He clashed with the only man capable of politically outmaneuvering him: Joseph Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1927, Stalin stripped Trotsky of his power and exiled him from the Soviet Union. For years, Trotsky lived as a ghost, fleeing from country to country with Stalin's assassins closing in, until August of 1940, where Leon Trotsky met his end with an ice axe to his head. I think by now it should be clear to you that Napoleon represents Stalin. You know what's coming next. Napoleon stood up and uttered a high-pitched whine, almost like a whistle. It was then we find out where those 9 puppies Napoleon stole away went.
At this, there was a terrible braying sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out of the door and they were after him. too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly, he slipped and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put an extra spurt and, with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more.
When I first read the scene, I was sure Snowball was going to return. But this is it. He never comes back after this. Until now, the revolution was making a positive impact, and the dream that Old Major spoke of in the very beginning of this book could still have been accomplished. But right here, at this moment, is when that dream died. It was not ideas or innovation that won in the end, it was brute strength. What's even more disturbing about this scene is that Napoleon doesn't even try to hide what he's doing. The dogs wag their tails in his presence exactly as they did for Jones. Even though they're all supposed to be comrades, Napoleon is undoubtedly their master. This is the most important scene in the entire novella, the definitive end of the first half. From here, the story shifts from an idealistic revolution into the brutal rise of a dictator. Napoleon goes up on stage and says that these Sunday morning debates are no longer necessary because they are a waste of time. From now on, all future ordeals related to the farm will be decided by a special committee solely consisting of pigs and presided over by Napoleon himself. Snowball's expulsion was a shock, and for the first time, there was discontent on the farm. Even Boxer was troubled. He tried to express what he was feeling, but remember, he was not educated. He couldn't put his thoughts into words. Perhaps if he could have rallied the animals and prevented the rest of the novel. He was the most highly regarded on the farm, and the animals would have followed him, but instead, Boxer just shook his head. However, Four Pigs stood up and raised concerns about the fact that Napoleon had basically overthrew Snowball. But the dog snarled and the Four Pigs were forced to back down. Immediately after that, the sheep started chanting 4 legs good, 2 legs bad for 15 minutes, which put an end to the argument. But the animals were still not convinced, so Napoleon brought out his strongest soldier, Squealer. Other than Snowball, he was the most well-spoken pig on the farm, and you already saw how he dismantled the situation with the milk. He did the same thing here. He went to the animals and said that Napoleon was bearing a heavy responsibility and that he would only be too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves, but sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Squealer suggests that Snowball was no better than a criminal and that his bravery at the Battle of the Cowshed was not as grand as everyone thought it was. He was basically admitting that they were going to pull a Big Brother and start rewriting history. Didn't I tell you that a lot of George Orwell's ideas for 1984 came from here? Why do you think this image exists? To wrap up his speech, Squealer used his usual tactic of using Jones's name. This seemed to work. The next Sunday, it was clear that the atmosphere on the farm had shifted. The animals were forced to walk in a single file and no longer allowed to sit together. Napoleon now simply read out orders and dismissed the crowd. But to everyone's surprise, Napoleon also said that the windmill was being built after all. Squealer was sent out to convince everyone that the project was always Napoleon's idea and that his earlier opposition was just a tactical maneuver to oust the traitor Snowball. And with 3 dogs snarling behind him, nobody questioned Squealer. The animals toiled away at building the windmill. They worked 60 hours a week throughout the spring. But even with all this work, it seemed like it wasn't enough. The harvests were less successful than the previous year. The upcoming winter was not going to be good. The animals had to drag boulders up a slope for the windmill. It was so difficult that even the pigs and Benjamin helped out. It often took a whole day just to drag one stone up, but when heavy lifting was required, only Boxer could be relied upon. He worked harder than ever. He pushed his body to its limits, waking up 45 minutes earlier than the others. Whenever he struggled, he would chant, "I will work harder," and Napoleon is always right, like he was David Goggins. The condition of the farm had obviously gotten worse. In fact, it was now comparable to when they were under Jones. But the animals consoled themselves by saying that at least they didn't have to feed the humans. At this point, it's fair to say that they were huffing that good copium because the food that once went to the humans was now just going to the pigs. Nothing changed. They were also facing a bigger problem. Because Animal Farm had essentially cut itself out from the rest of the world, they had also cut off their resources. The machinery needed for the windmill was simply not available on the farm. Eventually, they had to trade with the others, so that's exactly what they did. One Sunday, Napoleon announced he was opening trade with the neighboring farms to secure windmill materials. He planned to sell hay and wheat and, if necessary, chicken eggs, insisting the hens should be proud to sacrifice for the cause. A vague uneasiness settled over the farm. Dealing with humans was strictly prohibited, wasn't it? It's at moments like these where this book becomes genuinely frustrating to read. Like, you just want to scream at the animals to stop second guessing their own memories and just look at what's happening. But before the animals could even process the betrayal, the sheep's chanting drowned out their thoughts. Napoleon then reassured them by claiming he alone would handle the humans, framing it as a heroic burden he was taking upon his shoulders. Burden is in quotation marks, by the way. He then contacted one Mr. Whymper, who was going to be their broker. Though seeing a human was terrifying, the sight of Napoleon commanding him filled the animals with such pride that they just let it go. Meanwhile, the humans had transitioned from indifference to hatred. They studied Snowball's designs just to find flaws, yet they couldn't help but respect the farm. By this point, they had finally stopped calling it Manor Farm and started using Animal Farm. And what about Jones? Oh, he's just in another part of the country chilling. We never see him again, by the way. Even though Whymper was the only human who had contacted Animal Farm so far, there were rumors that Napoleon was considering an agreement with either Frederick or Pilkington. But since these two absolutely hated each other, he couldn't make deals with both. Back at Animal Farm, the pigs had moved into the farmhouse where Jones used to live. Squealer tried to convince them again, saying it was absolutely necessary that they live in the house and sleep in comfortable beds because they needed to be fully rested to think. So y'all see why I hate this guy yet? Don't worry, it's gonna get so much worse. This time, the animals weren't so easily convinced. Clover, remembering the 7 commandments, asked Muriel the goat to read the 4th one out aloud. She was certain it said, "No animal shall sleep in a bed." But when Muriel read the wall, it now said, "No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets." Till now, you've seen pigs break the commandments here and there, but it's never gotten to the point where they're literally rewriting the rules. But right here is when that changes. Squealer went to the walls and painted in "with sheets" onto the rest of the sentence so they can get away with sleeping on beds. Before the other animals could even discuss this, Squealer was already at the wall, launching into his usual routine about how Jones is going to come back if the pigs don't sleep on beds. Soon, the pigs woke up a full hour later than everyone else. Still, the animals didn't complain because they still trusted the pigs. With this scene, the pigs are essentially training the animals to question their own memory. Now, the animals are even more dependent on the pigs. The next autumn, the animals were tired but happy. Even though they knew the next winter was going to be rough, at least they had the windmill. The only animal that didn't celebrate was, of course, Benjamin. He was autofarming in the corner. In November, the rain came, turning the cement of the windmill into slush. Then one stormy night, a sound like a violent gunshot echoed through the farm. The animals rushed out to find their months of labor reduced to a pile of rubble. Even Napoleon charged to the site. After a long silence, he turned to the shivering animals and said this. "Comrades," he said quietly, "do you know who's responsible for this? Do you know the enemy who has come in the night and overthrown our windmill? Snowball." Since Snowball wasn't there to defend himself and the animals lacked critical thinking to challenge the lie, Napoleon successfully framed Snowball. There was no longer a need for animals to think if Napoleon did the right thing by ousting Snowball because Snowball is the traitor who destroyed their windmill. Of course he deserved to be exiled. To sweeten the deal, he offered Animal Heroes second class and a reward of apples to anyone who brought Snowball to justice. Now there's something I didn't mention in this chapter. When Napoleon gave the plans to build the windmill, he made the base only 18 inches thick. I don't think you understand how small that is. My laptop is only 14 inches. The base of a windmill shouldn't be comparable to the size of a laptop. The reason I brought this up is because this is an obvious flaw in the engineering of the windmill. It is the sole reason it failed. Something this thin can't hold up a windmill, so of course it fell. But Napoleon couldn't admit he made a mistake, so he blamed Snowball for it. This is a trend you're going to see for the rest of the novel. Whenever something goes wrong or there is any sort of problem, it's somehow Snowball's fault. Napoleon ordered an immediate rebuild. As the dreaded winter arrived, the animals toiled through the freeze, fueled by spite for Snowball. Interestingly, the humans didn't buy the saboteur story. They knew the walls were simply too thin, yet the narrator immediately shuts down that logic, stating, "The animals knew that this was not the case. Despite Squealer's rhetoric about the dignity of labor and stuff, the animals were losing heart. They were freezing and starving. It was only Boxer's strength, not Squealer's speeches, that kept the farm moving. By January, even Napoleon had to face the reality of imminent starvation. Desperate to hide this weakness from the humans who were already spreading rumors of disease and infighting, Napoleon used Whimper to spread counter-narratives about Animal Farm's prosperity. He knew if the truth got out, Animal Farm was cooked. To sell the lie, Napoleon used the sheep to boast about increased rations within earshot of Whimper. He even tricked Whimper by filling food bins with sand and topping them with a thin layer of grain. But Napoleon knew that this facade was unsustainable. His solution to the famine was a contract of 400 eggs a week. Hearing this, the chickens conducted the first true rebellion under Napoleon's reign. Led by 3 young chickens, the hens flew to the rafters and smashed their eggs on the floor rather than surrender them to the trade. Napoleon's retaliation was absolute. He cut their rations completely and said that anyone caught feeding them would be executed. The strike only lasted 5 days before the hens broke, but not before 9 of them had died. Whimper collected the eggs, oblivious to the slaughter at Animal Farm. Napoleon then turned his focus to timber and conducting business with his neighbors. But somehow Snowball was always hiding on whichever farm he wasn't dealing with at the time. Then one day, Squealer said that not only was Snowball plotting an invasion with Frederick of Pinchfield, but he had actually been working for Jones since the very beginning. Snowball's bravery at the Battle of the Cowshed was apparently a lie. The animals were stunned when they heard this. They remembered, or thought they remembered, him being brave and leading them to a complete victory. Also, the gunshot wound Snowball took at the battle was apparently just a stunt, a mere graze for dramatic effect before he surrendered the farm to Jones. The real hero, according to Squealer, was Napoleon, who supposedly saved the day by biting Jones's leg and screaming death to humanity. Guys, just completely forget about the fact that Napoleon wasn't even there at the Battle of the Cowshed. The animals heard this, the most obvious lie Squealer has ever said, and were like, "Ah yeah, that makes sense," before going back to work. But my goat Boxer rubbed his 3 brain cells together and said, "I do not believe Snowball was a traitor at the beginning," he said finally. "What he has done since is different. But I believe that at the Battle of the Cowshed, he was a good comrade."
Yes! 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 Yes!
But Napoleon said it was true, so Boxer agreed.
No! No! No!
Even if Boxer now agreed, Squealer was still casting an ugly glance at him. He had not liked that Boxer had questioned him. Squealer even told all the animals to be careful, saying Snowball's secret agents are still around us. Up until now, there had been threats of violence and secret disappearances and all that, but the next scene is the single most brutal scene in the novella, so be prepared. 4 days later, Napoleon called all the animals for a meeting, surrounded by all his 9 dogs. After the animals had gathered, Napoleon whistled, just as he had months ago against Snowball, and the dogs leapt forward. They grabbed 4 pigs by the ears and dragged them in front of all the animals. 3 dogs even flung themselves at Boxer, but Boxer is built different, so he caught them midair and slammed them to the ground. However, Napoleon told him to let the dog go, and Boxer did. After the initial commotion had died down, Napoleon called on the pigs to confess their sins. It was then we get to know that these were the same pigs who had originally protested when Napoleon took over. They confessed that they were in touch with Snowball, helped him destroy the windmill, and intended to give the farm to Frederick. They also said that Snowball was Jones's secret agent. After they were done speaking, the dogs tore their throats out. Napoleon then asked if any other animals would like to confess their sins. The 3 hens who led the 5-day rebellion against him came forward. They too were killed. Then a goose, then 3 sheep, all supposedly collaborating with Snowball, and all slaughtered. This went on for some time, an animal coming forward and dying until there was a pile of corpses on the ground. By the time it was over, all the animals were traumatized. They had not seen this level of brutality since Jones used to skin them. But it was worse because there was no human this time. It really was animal on animal violence. The remaining animals huddled together for warmth, mourning their dead. Everyone was there except for the cat, who had vanished before the meeting. This is the cat's final mention in the book, by the way. The cat realized that the revolution no longer served her and just dipped. Unlike the others, she had the means to leave, so she did. Ironically, the only characters with happy endings are the cat and Molly, the ones who were too selfish to believe in the dream of rebellion in the first place. Compare them for a second to Boxer, who turns to all the animals and said,
I do not understand it. I would not have believed that such things could happen on our farm. It must be due to some fault in ourselves. The solution, as I see it, is to work harder. From now onwards, I shall get up a full hour earlier in the mornings.
Even though the scene where he one-shotted the dog showed that if Boxer wanted to, he could take over the farm, Napoleon's manipulation was so successful that Boxer was blaming himself and the other animals for the executions. He can't see that Napoleon is becoming a bloodthirsty psychopath. After Boxer left, the other animals remained there, looking down at the farm they had sacrificed everything for. Orwell gives us a rare breath of stillness, describing the long pastures and the golden sunlight splashing over the green fields. The farm was beautiful, more desirable than they had ever realized, but for the animals, the dream is already dead. As Clover looked down the hillside, her eyes filled with tears. If she could have spoken her thoughts, it would have been to say that this was not what they wished for when they rebelled against the human race. These scenes of terror and slaughter were not what they looked forward to on that night when Old Major told them about the rebellion. I think this is where we, as readers, realize that we are not getting a happy ending. The narrator even says that Clover could not express these thoughts in words. She felt the corruption, she could recognize it, but since she couldn't put it into words, it was useless. In an attempt to spill out her feelings in some sort of way, she started singing Beasts of England. All the animals sang it 3 times, but it didn't have the power it once had. The text even says that they sang it mournfully. Just as they finished singing it a 3rd time, Squealer approached them with 2 dogs at his side to tell them that Napoleon had banned the song Beasts of England. When the animals questioned why, this is what Squealer said.
It is no longer needed, comrade, said Squealer stiffly. Beasts of England was the song of the rebellion, but the rebellion is now completed. The execution of the traitors this afternoon was the final act. The enemy, both external and internal, has been defeated. In Beasts of England, we express our longing for a better society in days to come, but that society has now been established. Clearly, this song has no longer any purpose.
Even though the animals were scared and overworked, they were about to protest this. But just then, the sheep on the farm started bleating, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, over and over and over again, until the time for discussion was over. With this move, the pigs had taken away the last way animals could express themselves. They had won. A few days later, the animals went to check the 7 commandments again. They thought they remembered the 6th commandment being, "No animal shall kill any other." Clover asked Benjamin to read it, but he said no, saying he refused to meddle in such affairs. So she asked Muriel to do it instead. When Muriel read the 6th commandment, it read, "No animal shall kill any other animal without cause." Throughout the year, the animals worked harder than ever, yet their bellies remained empty. Whenever Squealer appeared, he would rattle off inflated figures claiming that food production had increased by 500%. The animals believed him. They could no longer remember life before the rebellion, and Benjamin, the only one who could, remained silent. Napoleon had become a recluse, appearing barely twice a month, and when he did, he was guarded by dogs and preceded by a black cockerel that acted as his trumpeter. He lived in total isolation within the farmhouse, and his birthday was now treated as a national holiday. Napoleon's paranoia had also gotten worse. He now had 4 guards and another pig to taste test his food for poison before he ate it. There were even some executions of chickens who were supposedly inspired by Snowball to murder Napoleon. Just like Stalin, he was not called Napoleon anymore. He was always called leader or father of all animals. Squealer would cry while talking about Napoleon's wisdom and the love he had for all animals. It was obvious that he was more than just their leader now. He was more akin to their god, really. Whenever something good happened on the farm, it was because of Napoleon. Even a simple drink of clean water was thanks to Comrade Napoleon. They even wrote a whole song about him that they etched on the walls of the barn near the 7 commandments alongside a portrait of him. Now, getting back to the timber trade with Frederick and Pilkington, Frederick was now absolutely desperate to buy it, but he would not offer a reasonable price. Because of this, a rumor circulated around Animal Farm that Snowball was yet again at Pinchfield and that Frederick and his men were going to attack Animal Farm out of pure jealousy. At around the same time, it was decided that Napoleon was going to enter an agreement with Pilkington, whom they were almost on friendly terms with at this point. Even the animals who hated human beings preferred him over Frederick. This meant the rumors about Frederick had gotten worse. ironically mirroring what the human beings had done to Animal Farm when it was just beginning. Frederick was allegedly going to bring 20 men with guns and had apparently flogged a horse to death, starved the cows, and even killed a dog by throwing it into the furnace. Wait, is that a JoJo reference? Considering who this dude was based on, there is a non-0% chance that these aren't just rumors. Hearing all this, the animals were enraged and they were ready to jump across the farm and take care of Frederick themselves. But Squealer calmed them down. Napoleon said that there was no way they would make an agreement with someone who treated animals that poorly, and he changed their slogan from death to humanity to death to Frederick. The wheat crops had failed again, and apparently Snowball had planted weeds along with the wheat. Now the story was that Snowball had never even received Animal Hero First Class. That was apparently just a rumor he had spread himself. Once again, the animals bought it after a little bit of convincing. By autumn, the windmill was finished. The animals were tired, but they were proud of what they had built and walked around it with a sort of awe. We even get this line.
Moreover, the walls were twice as thick as before. Nothing short of explosives would lay them low this time.
Say the line, Bart!
Foreshadowing is a literary device. The windmill was named Napoleon Mill. It was named by Napoleon. 2 days later, in a meeting, it was revealed that Napoleon had sold the timber to Frederick. All relations with Foxwood had broken off. The slogan was even changed from death to Frederick to death to Pilkington. When the animals questioned him, he said that the rumors had been created by Snowball and his agents. He claimed that Snowball had been hiding out with Pilkington this whole time actually. It should go without saying that this whole segment of the story is an obvious reference to the non-aggression pact that Russia had struck with Germany. I had already told you how that ended, didn't I? The pigs were amazed at how clever Napoleon was. The fact that he had already obtained the money to buy the machinery for the windmill by selling wood to Frederick all this time. Napoleon, always the showman, lay down with literal stacks of cash next to him and the animals walked around him, gazing at it. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. Wimper rushed to warn them about what had occurred. The banknotes that Napoleon had so cleverly acquired were forgeries. Napoleon rushed out into the farm and immediately issued a death sentence upon Frederick, screaming that when he found him, he would be boiled alive. It was also revealed that the rumors about Frederick were kinda true. He was approaching the farm with guns. Napoleon immediately folded like a lawn chair and sent birds out to Pilkington for help. The next morning, the attack came. Frederick and his friends had entered the gate. There were 15 of them and half had guns. Napoleon and Boxer tried to rally the animals, but they were driven back and had to hide in the buildings, watching what the enemy did. It seems like when Snowball isn't there, Napoleon isn't that smart after all, is he? Napoleon paced up and down, hoping, praying that Pilkington would help them. The birds that he had sent out arrived back with a scrap of paper. There were only 3 words written on it.
Serves you right.
Frederick and his men took a crowbar and sledgehammer to the windmill, but Napoleon was confident that they wouldn't budge. The walls were too thick this time. But Benjamin nodded, almost amused, and said that they weren't trying to smash the walls, they were going to plant explosives. After a few minutes, the men started running in all directions. Then the animals heard a loud bang. The windmill that they had worked so hard to build after failing once was now ashes. Seeing this, the animals saw red and rushed at them. Even though the bullets hit them and some died, they fought off the men. Frederick shouted to everyone to retreat and they all ran away. The animals had won the fight, but they were bleeding and tired. There were corpses of many animals on the ground. This was not a victory. They looked up at where their windmill used to be. There were now just ashes. There weren't even solid stones like last time. There was nothing to rebuild with. It was all gone. Squealer, who was absent from the fight by the way, came and said it was time to celebrate. But Boxer, whose legs had been injured, simply said there was nothing to celebrate. They had destroyed the windmill. When Squealer said that they would just build another one, Boxer said,
Then we have won back what we had before.
For an animal that is canonically supposed to be stupid, that is quite wise. Like, even when Squealer says that this was their victory, the narrator doesn't even say that Boxer agrees with any of this, which he had said so many times. Napoleon still congratulated the animals on the battle, and the animals that died in the battle were given a solemn funeral. Although they weren't given any animal hero medals. Giving them those would put them on par with Napoleon, and we couldn't have that, right? A few nights later, from within the farmhouse, the animals heard a sound they hadn't heard in a very long time. beasts of England. See, earlier that day, the pigs had discovered alcohol in the cellar of the farmhouse, and now they were drunk. They even saw Napoleon drunk out of his mind running around the farm before returning. The next day, Squealer came in to announce that Napoleon was dying. His last decree before death was that no animal shall drink alcohol, and the ones that do will be punished by death. By the next morning, however, Napoleon was fine and even asked Whymper to purchase material to make alcohol. This dude wasn't dying, he was just hung over and probably lied about the pain being intense because you know how Napoleon is. And now he's going to drink even more. That noon, there was a crash at the farmhouse where the 7 commandments were written. When all the animals went to check it out, they saw Squealer beside a broken ladder with a paintbrush. Only Benjamin knew what this meant. When Muriel read the 7 commandments a few days later to check the 5th commandment, it was now, no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. They had caught Squealer in the act of literally rewriting the rules, but they couldn't understand why, and the only person who did was Benjamin. You know what? Forget Squealer for a minute. Let's talk about Benjamin. This guy knows what's going on and still doesn't act. He could have so easily stopped all these tragedies from happening, but he didn't because he felt it didn't affect him. But Benjamin will soon discover that his actions, or lack thereof, have consequences. Boxer's hoof took a long time to heal, but even with that, he was still helping to rebuild the windmill. He didn't even let people know he was in pain. The only one he would talk to about it was Clover, who would prepare medicines for him privately. Benjamin even suggested that Boxer shouldn't work that hard. Boxer was not as young or strong as he used to be, but he brushed them off. The only thing left for him in this life was retirement. No animal had actually ever retired yet, but that time was coming for many animals that were originally part of the farm before the revolution. See, the retired animals were promised a nice pension that would last them the rest of their lives. There were many more animals now than there were before. The farm was barely surviving now, and even the little food they did have was being sold off. The chickens now had to provide 600 eggs a week and barely had enough chicks to survive. The rations were reduced again and again, and even the lanterns were forbidden to save oil. However, the pigs were getting a pint of beer daily as rations. Even the barley was reserved only for pigs. But even though the conditions were getting so much worse, the celebrations never ended. There were even more grand speeches that showed the triumphs of Animal Farm, followed by Squealer's speech about Napoleon and how the grain had increased by 500% again. All the animals really did like these celebrations because it was a sign of their freedom. With these, they could almost forget that they were starving. In April, Animal Farm became a republic, and when it came time to elect a president, there was only one candidate. On the same day he was elected, Napoleon found more documents about Snowball. Now the story was Snowball had been the leader of the human forces and had charged in with them. It was Napoleon who had stopped him and inflicted those wounds. There was also the return of Moses. You remember him, the raven, the preacher raven? This time the pigs did not shoo him away though, because they needed him to tell stories about Sugar Candy Mountain, so the animals had something to look forward to. He was even given beer daily for his work. But one day, the animals found out something no one wanted to see. Boxer had fallen. His lung had collapsed. He couldn't get up. When Clover asked him how he was, Boxer talked about how he had been waiting for retirement and that he and Benjamin could retire together. When all the other animals went to get the pigs, only Benjamin and Clover remained by his side. Then Squealer appeared and told them that Boxer was going to be sent to a veterinarian in Willingdon. While all the animals were uncomfortable with sending Boxer to a human, Squealer convinced them that the vet had more resources than the animals did to treat the problem. But until that could be arranged, Boxer stayed in his stall with Clover and Benjamin. It was only then Boxer talked about something other than work. Maybe he could spend the rest of his life learning the remaining letters of the alphabet and improve his mind. It was the middle of the day when Boxer was taken away, but all the animals saw a strange sight. They saw Benjamin galloping, braying at the top of his voice, telling the animals that Boxer was being taken away. Without even waiting for the pigs, all the animals went to see Boxer and say goodbye to him. Benjamin, however, screamed that they were all fools, and when Muriel began slowly reading out what was written on the van, he pushed her away and read,
Alfred Simmons, horse slaughterer and glue boiler, Willingdon, dealer in hides and bone meal, kennels supplied.
There was a cry of horror as they chased the van. Some even begged the horses pulling the carriage to stop, but they didn't because they were uneducated. Clover, now old and far past her prime, tried to run after him and screamed his name. I'm not a person who usually cries over fictional characters. I'm not saying this to sound macho, it's just something I never do. But there's a line here while Boxer's being taken away that was the closest I've come to actually crying while reading a book. Let me show it to you. The time had been when a few kicks from Boxer's hooves would have smashed the van to matchwood, but alas, his strength had left him, and in a few moments, the sound of drumming hooves grew fainter and died away. Boxer, the strongest animal on the farm, had given his life and body to build a better place for his comrades, but now, as he's being taken away to his death, his body finally failed him. He was never seen again. A few days later, Squealer announced that Boxer had passed away in the hospital. He said that Boxer's only regret was not finishing the windmill. Squealer then addressed the rumors about Boxer being taken away to the knackers. He dismissed them as simple misunderstandings, and the animals, as always, bought it. That night, the animals saw a van drive up to the farmhouse to deliver another case of whiskey. In the book, it's heavily implied that the pigs bought that alcohol with the money they got from killing Boxer. For all intents and purposes, the death of Boxer is basically the climax of Animal Farm. The final chapter serves more as an epilogue than anything, and it's the most dystopian this story is going to get. Any more, and we are literally going to get Pig Brother. Years passed, and only a handful of animals who were around during the time of Jones remained. Even Jones himself had passed away. Many new animals had been born or bought to replace those who were gone. Among them were 3 new horses who, while strong and hardworking, were even more dumb than Boxer. They were good comrades, but they lacked the capacity to even think about questioning the pigs. This was the only world they had ever known. Animal Farm finally had the windmill that they had been craving for. Although it was not used to generate electricity and free the animals as Snowball had originally intended, it was instead used to mill corn and generate profit. The dream of electricity and the 3-day work week was no longer even discussed. It had become a distant memory, often confused with fiction. Such comforts were contrary to the spirit of animalism, Napoleon said, and that was enough. Even though the farm was technically the richest it had ever been, the animals still felt poor as ever. Except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs, who were now many in number. Squealer was still around, explaining why the dogs and pigs could not perform manual labor, but he had reached the point where the animals didn't even understand his complex language anymore. They had become so ignorant that they simply believed him without question. The older animals tried to remember the time before Jones, attempting to compare whether then was indeed worse than now, but they couldn't. The only one who could remember was Benjamin, who said life was never much better or worse. Throughout this book, it's clear that Benjamin is the smartest animal on the farm, save perhaps for Snowball. But in a way, he's just as ignorant as the others. While the other animals are trapped by their lack of knowledge, Benjamin is trapped by his own beliefs. Both are equally imprisoned. It's painful to see that Benjamin could have stopped this descent into tyranny so many times, but because he believed life was only about hunger and hardship and disappointment, he never chose to act. Now, I may be reaching here, and it's not in any of the sources I looked at for this essay, but I feel like Orwell was trying to critique pessimism. While this ideology may protect you by preparing you for the worst, it destroys everyone else. I think the true tragedy of Animal Farm isn't just the corruption of the pigs, but also the silence of the wise like Benjamin. Even though he said that life was not much better or worse, the book says that he had gotten significantly more miserable since Boxer's death. At this point, Benjamin is just lying to himself. Even during such harsh times, the animals still talked about their glory days, about how they had written the 7 commandments and defeated Jones. They were the only farm in the country owned and operated by animals, and they could, at the very least, take pride in that. It was the one thing they could still hang on to, but there is a profound sense of despair and desperation running through the segment, especially in lines like these. No creature called any other creature master. All animals were equal. One day, Squealer took all the sheep and rounded them up in a secluded area away from the others. He was teaching them a new song in private. Then, Clover saw something that horrified her. It was Squealer walking on his hind legs with perfect balance. Then, from the farmhouse, one pig after another walked out on their hind legs. And finally, Napoleon himself emerged carrying a whip in his trotter. The image of the pigs becoming so cruel that they literally become humans and stand on their hind legs really stuck with me. Like, I was genuinely unsettled when I first read this. It's a great horror scene. The animals, despite how much they had suffered without a single word of complaint, were about to finally speak up. And just then we hear, 4 legs good,
2 legs better.
The chanting went on for so long that the animals eventually quieted down and didn't protest. When they went to the barn to read the commandments again, Clover asked Benjamin to read them for her as her eyes could no longer see clearly. She even asked him if the 7 commandments were still the same, and Benjamin read out the only thing written there.
All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
The pigs had made the population so ignorant that they no longer needed to hide their corruption. They openly admitted that some animals are more equal than the others, essentially telling the rest that there was nothing they could do about it. A week later, some human visitors came over, and the animals were no longer sure whom they were more terrified of, the pigs or the humans. That evening, laughter echoed from the farmhouse. It was the first time that animals and humans were meeting on terms of equality. Driven by curiosity, the animals crept up to the farmhouse window, waiting and listening. The pigs and humans were sitting together with Napoleon naturally at the head of the table. Pilkington was there and he presented a toast to everyone, saying that it was an honor to have Animal Farm as a partner. He stated that all the past hostility between them was now just water under the bridge. During his visit, he had found many features on Animal Farm that he intended to introduce to his own farm. While the table roared with laughter, Pilkington said,
"If you have your lower animals to contend with," he said, "we have our lower classes."
Orwell doesn't even try to hide it behind a facade of animals and farm owners. He just outright says it here. This is the most biting line in the book and probably the reason most publishers didn't want to publish it. Then they finally toasted to the prosperity of Animal Farm. After cheering, Napoleon stood up and said that the idea that the animals were ever trying to stir up rebellion in other farms was just a rumor circulated by a mysterious enemy, totally not Snowball. They were not revolutionaries, they were farm owners. Now that everyone knew that, they could conduct business on equal terms. There were even some customs that he was going to change on Animal Farm. The custom of animals referring to one another as comrade was a silly practice and would be suppressed. The hoof and horn on Animal Farm's flag had been removed. It was a plain green flag now. Napoleon said that the only problem he had with Pilkington's speech was that he referred to this place as Animal Farm. Napoleon just changed the name back to Manor Farm, which he believed to be the original and correct name. Then he toasted not to the prosperity of Animal Farm, but to that of the Manor Farm. Everyone cheered and they settled in for a game of cards. The final lines of the novel are these.
The creatures outside looked from pig to man and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which.
By the time Orwell was finally able to publish Animal Farm in August of 1945, World War II had already ended. The enemy had been defeated, the Austrian painter was gone, and there was finally peace between the nations. Immediately after the World War ended, the grand alliance between the three nations began to fracture and the Cold War began. Stalin went from being Uncle Joe to the mortal enemy of the West once again. Suddenly, publishers looked at Animal Farm, a short, easy-to-read book that harshly critiqued their new enemy, and were like, yeah, this is a masterpiece. So when it was finally published, Animal Farm was being pushed by the government, the same people who were suppressing the book just a few months back, and it became an immediate, massive success, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. Even though Orwell's life after Animal Farm was filled with tragedy, the fact that the book he wrote to satirize the government was being promoted by the government is incredibly funny in a cynical way. A book about a stolen revolution being stolen by the state to serve its own ends. It's genuinely the perfect ending to the story of Animal Farm. With all that said, thank you for watching and have a good day.